in the candlelit halls of medieval castles, where golden goblets shimmered and lutes sang softly. Danger often sat silently beside the throne.
Royal feasts were not simply grand celebrations. They were traps disguised in splendor.
Every dish, every cup of wine, could be a weapon. The higher the guest's status, the greater the risk. Poison was the perfect tool for those hungry for power.
It left no blood on the floor, no screams in the night, only a silent victory.
Assassins disguised as cooks or servants would slip deadly mixtures of arsenic, belladonna, or mercury into a noble's food. Sometimes, even tasters could not detect it in time. One chilling account tells of Lord Ranulph, a trusted advisor who served the king faithfully until ambition overtook loyalty. At a lavish banquet, he laced the royal stew with poison meant for the heir. But fate intervened. The king himself took the first bite. Within moments, his body went cold as panic erupted across the hall. The murderer was never caught.
Behind the laughter and music of these feasts lay constant fear.
Every toast could be a farewell. Every banquet, a battlefield of invisible weapons. In the medieval world, a feast could end a reign as swiftly as war. The night of King Alaric's final banquet was meant to celebrate peace, yet it became a feast of death. His grand hall glittered with silver platters, roasted game, and spiced wine imported from distant lands. Nobles smiled, minstrels played, and servants hurried between tables. But beneath the noise of celebration, treachery whispered through the shadows. Unknown to the king, a plot had been brewing within his very court. His trusted advisor, fearing dismissal, had arranged for a slow-acting poison to be mixed into the king's wine. As the monarch raised his goblet, unaware of his fate, he toasted to loyalty, the very thing that would kill him. Moments later, his smile faded. The color drained from his face as his goblet fell to the floor.
The hall erupted in panic.
Some guests screamed. Others fled, fearing the same doom. But the assassin calmly watched, his secret buried beneath the chaos. The king's body was buried with honor, his death blamed on divine will. Yet whispers of poison lingered for generations. In medieval courts, death by dagger was brutal, but death by banquet was elegant, silent, and nearly impossible to trace. Every royal table in medieval Europe was a stage, and every guest a player in a deadly drama. Behind jeweled cups and silver platters, kings measured loyalty, while nobles sharpened invisible daggers of deceit. The banquet was not merely a meal. It was the testing ground of ambition. Each dish was carefully arranged, not only for taste, but for politics. Who sat closest to the king? Who was served first? Every gesture revealed favor or disgrace. Beneath the laughter, rivalries burned hotter than the roasted meats. Spies whispered in corners, alliances shifted, and secrets changed hands like cups of wine. At one such feast, Queen Isolde of Aragon famously served her husband's enemies a meal seasoned, not with poison, but humiliation. She fed them from cracked plates while her allies dined from gold. The insult sparked rebellion within months. In the age of power and paranoia, food was both nourishment and weapon. The royal table could crown a man or condemn him. Every sip carried risk. Every glance concealed meaning. Behind the shimmering candlelight of medieval banquets, betrayal was always on the menu. The medieval banquet, a vision of abundance, music, and celebration, hides a world far darker than the paintings suggest. While nobles feasted on roasted swans, stuffed peacocks, and honey-glazed fruits, the peasants outside starved in silence. The feast was not a sign of joy, but of dominance, a cruel display of who held power and who did not. Whist was beyond imagination. After endless courses, most of the untouched food was discarded to rot in the courtyard. Servants were forbidden to touch leftovers unless the Lord granted permission. Every slice of wasted meat was a reminder of inequality so vast it bordered on cruelty. But gluttony wasn't the only sign at the table. Feasts often doubled as political traps. Guests would smile through clenched teeth, each one aware that poison, betrayal, or insult could strike at any moment. Alliances were made and broken between sips of wine. The grand banquets we romanticize today were not joyous gatherings. They were theaters of corruption and greed. Behind every overflowing platter lay the suffering of hundreds who toiled to fill it. The dark truth is simple. Medieval feasts were built on fear, hunger, and human cost. It was the winter of 1349 when King Ferdinand of Castile hosted the most splendid feast of his reign.
The castle was ablaze with torchlight. Minstrels played triumphant songs,
and nobles from every corner of the realm gathered to celebrate victory. The tables groaned under roasted boar, spiced figs, and silver pitchers of ruby wine. Yet, hidden within the joy was a silent killer. A trusted advisor, desperate for power, had arranged for the royal wine to be laced with a tasteless poison. But fate had its own plans. The goblets were mixed, and the toxins spread through the hall. Within an hour, laughter turned to screams. Lords collapsed upon the tables, their lips blue, their breaths gone. The king survived, but hundreds did not. The event became known as the Feast of Death, a night where celebration transformed into a massacre. For centuries, ballads were sung of that cursed banquet, warning that greed and betrayal always sat closest to the throne. In medieval courts, death did not always come from battlefields or blades. Sometimes, it came softly, served on a silver platter beneath the glow of 1,000 candles. In medieval courts, poison was not just a weapon, it was an art form.
A single drop could bring down a dynasty.
The poisoned chalice became a symbol of betrayal, so refined that even knights and kings feared their own wine.
In the 13th century, the Earl of Wessex invited his rival to a reconciliation feast.
The tables sparkled with silver, the hall echoed with laughter, and both men raised their goblets in a show of peace.
But the Earl's servant had already done the devil-esque work, slipping a rare Venetian toxin into one of the cups.
Moments later, the rival fell silent, his veins blackening before the horrified guests. No blade had been drawn, yet a war was won that night. The Earl claimed innocence, swearing his friend had been struck by God's will. The poison, impossible to trace, left no evidence. In the brutal politics of medieval Europe, food became the perfect disguise for murder. The nobler, the feast, the deadlier, the risk, every drink, every toast, carried a whisper of death. Those who sought power didn't draw swords, they simply poured another cup of wine. Medieval kings ruled with greed as heavy as their crowns, and nowhere was it clearer than in their feasts. While peasants starved in mud huts, monarchs devoured enough food to feed villages for weeks. At King Edward IV's coronation banquet, records show over 1,000 animals roasted, from swans and peacocks to whole oxen, much of it left uneaten. The waste was staggering. Servants were forbidden to eat leftovers, unless permitted, and barrels of untouched meat were thrown into rivers. Feasts were not just about pleasure, they were statements of dominance. Each extravagant dish told the poor, "This is power you'll never taste." But gluttony carried its own punishment. Obesity, gout, and digestive diseases plagued the royal class. Even physicians warned that indulgence was killing kings faster than war. Yet they refused moderation. To eat little was to appear weak, and in a world where image ruled, even hunger became political. Behind the shimmering banquets was a cruel irony. The more the powerful consumed, the more they were consumed by their own excess. Their plates overflowed with food, and their souls with sin. Not every death at a medieval feast was meant to be seen. Many vanished quietly, their killers protected by rank, money, or silence.
The banquet hall, filled with laughter and song, was often a theater for invisible crimes.
At a royal wedding in France, a count collapsed. The cause was declared bad wine. But witnesses whispered that a rival noble had bribed a servant to lace his drink. The servant disappeared the next morning. His body was found weeks later in a well. Medieval records are filled with such mysteries: nobles who fell ill after dinner, knights who never woke after dessert. Poison wasn't always the cause. Some were strangled in their chambers after the feast, their deaths hidden behind false stories of feasting too much. Because in a world ruled by honor, Public scandal was worse than murder. Families paid gold to keep secrets buried. Priests held confessions they could never speak aloud. The grand banquets we imagine as glittering celebrations were often graveyards of ambition. Every candle that burned bright might have witnessed a crime, and every smile across the royal table might have hidden a killer's heart. It was the year 1422 when King Edmund of Northumbria gathered his court for a feast celebrating his son Esengagi. The castle was alive with music, torches, and the scent of spiced venison. But by the next morning, the king would be dead and his son accused of murder. According to chroniclers, Edmund's final toast was to the future of the crown. Moments later, his goblet slipped from his grasp. He fell to the floor, gasping as chaos broke out.
The royal physician declared poison, but no one knew who had access to the king's cup.
Suspicion fell on his son, Prince Ethelric, who stood to inherit everything. Yet evidence later pointed to the court's treasurer, who had been secretly funneling funds for rebellion. Before he could be arrested, he vanished, leaving only a servant-esque confession that the poison was meant for another. The king's death plunged the realm into war. His story became legend, a grim reminder that no feast, no matter how grand, was free from betrayal. In medieval courts, the deadliest wars didn't always start on battlefields. Some began quietly, over a cup of wine, raised in celebration. Imagine a world where every dinner invitation could be your last. In medieval Europe, banquets were less about friendship and more about survival. Each noble came armed, not with swords, but with suspicion. Behind every toast was a test of loyalty.
Behind every smile, a hidden threat.
Food tasters became essential members of royal courts. They risked their lives with every bite, tasting the king's food before he dared touch it. Yet even they sometimes failed. For clever assassins knew how to mask poison with sugar, wine, or spices. At the court of Naples, one cunning duchess turned banquets into traps. She invited her enemies to dine, offering special dishes as tokens of peace. Those who ate them rarely lived to see morning. Her charm became her deadliest weapon.
Over time, nobles began bringing their own cups, utensils, even personal cooks, to avoid death.
But paranoia could never protect them completely. For in a world where power meant everything, the dining table became the most dangerous battlefield of all. In the glittering halls of kings and queens, death often wore the sweetest smile and was served alongside the finest wine. The royal banquet of 1381 was meant to display unity after years of rebellion. Golden chandeliers sparkled, and 1,000 candles lit the vast stone hall. Every noble in the kingdom sat under the king's watchful eye, pretending peace, while plotting vengeance. Beneath the polished silver trays and jeweled goblets, lies flowed more freely than wine.
Enemies toasted each other with poisoned smiles.
Servants whispered rumors between courses, and secret glances told stories no one dared speak aloud. The feast became a performance, each guest acting loyal, each fearing discovery. As the night wore on, a nobleman named Lord Helric suddenly collapsed mid-sentence. The laughter stopped. Some said he choked on a bone. Others whispered the word poison. His body was quietly removed, his death written off as accident. But everyone at the table knew the truth. One rival had struck. The king said nothing, but from that night forward, every meal was tasted by 3 servants. Fear ruled the table. No one trusted anyone. The feast, meant to unite the court, instead exposed its corruption. In the world of kings, truth was always the first thing to die. Right after dinner was served.
When we imagine medieval dining, we picture laughter, music, and gold-laden tables, but the reality was far more sinister.
Feasts were theaters of both pleasure and punishment. The bloody table was not just a myth. It was a name whispered across kingdoms. In 1317, King Theobald of Navarre hosted a grand banquet to celebrate victory over his enemies. He invited every noble, even those suspected of treason. Midway through the feast, guards surrounded the hall, sealing the doors. The king stood and declared, Let traitors dine with death tonight. Within minutes, chaos erupted. Selected guests were seized and executed before the others, their blood staining the feast table. The screams of the dying mixed with the music still playing. The survivors were forced to continue eating, their trembling hands clutching cups of wine that tasted like guilt. That night became legend, a symbol of power and terror. Feasts were never just about food. They were about dominance. The king's message was clear. To defy the crown was to die where you dined. For centuries, nobles feared banquets, for behind every toast might come the blade. In an age where a single sip could end a reign, kings learned to treat every meal like a battlefield. The fear of poison haunted every royal feast. To survive, rulers developed elaborate rituals of testing and protection. Before a king touched his plate, food tasters risked their lives, sampling every dish under watchful eyes. Some even waited hours before allowing the king to eat, ensuring no symptoms appeared. The royal physicians studied herbs and antidotes, learning how to detect the faintest signs of danger. King Charles V of France was so paranoid that he had his meals prepared by monks, men sworn to God, believed incapable of treachery. Even then, he ate only after his hound sniffed the food. Other monarchs used silver forks, believing they could detect poison, and drank from crystal goblets meant to change color in the presence of toxins. But none of it guaranteed safety. Assassins grew smarter, poisons subtler. Many rulers still fell silently. In the medieval world, even the mightiest king could be brought to his knees by a single grain of powder. For them, every feast was a gamble, and survival was never served on the menu. While peasants begged for crumbs outside castle gates, inside, royal tables overflowed with unimaginable luxury. At the coronation of King Richard II, over 20,000 dishes were served, many of them thrown away and eaten. To waste food was not shameful. It was a display of wealth and dominance. Excess was the language of power. Lords competed to see who could host the grandest banquet, commissioning exotic meats like dolphins, cranes, and peacocks dyed with gold. Servants spent days preparing dishes no one would even touch. The leftovers, rotting in courtyards, attracted rats larger than cats. Chroniclers wrote of nobles eating until they vomited, only to continue feasting again. Doctors warned of noble sickness, a mix of gluttony and pride that consumed kingdoms from within. Yet still the feasts continued, each one louder, richer, crueler. To the starving commoners who watched from outside, those banquets were a nightmare of greed. The smell of wasted food became the scent of oppression. The sin of excess poisoned the soul of medieval royalty, a poison no antidote could cure. And in time, that same arrogance would crumble their empires. In 1468, Duke Conrad of Bavaria invited rival nobles to a feast of peace. The great hall shone with banners, and servants carried platters heavy with roasted meat and wine. But the duke's smile hid a secret. The banquet was an ambush. As guests ate and drank, guards quietly locked the doors.
Without warning, soldiers stormed in, cutting down the Duke's enemies where they sat.
Blood splattered across the feast table, soaking the bread and spilling into the goblets. The screams of the dying were drowned by music still playing, as if death itself had joined the celebration. Those who survived called it the murderous meal, a night when food and death shared the same table. The Duke justified it as justice, claiming those slain had plotted treason. But in truth, it was revenge disguised as ceremony. The massacre spread fear through all of Europe. After that night, few nobles ever trusted an invitation from Conrad's court again. In the end, the Duke's reign was short-lived. He was poisoned a year later at his own banquet. The hunter had become the prey. In the world of medieval power, every plate carried a secret. A feast was not just food, it was warfare wrapped in gold. Rivals didn't strike with swords, they struck with salt, wine, and honeyed meat. At the royal court of Florence, two powerful dukes sat side by side, their rivalry masked by forced smiles. The host, Duke Lorenzo, had planned a deadly game. He invited his enemy to dine as a gesture of peace, but hired an alchemist to lace the roast pheasant with a slow-acting poison. It was so subtle that the victim felt only warmth and dizziness, passing away days later. The poisoner was never caught. His art was his silence. Rumors spread that the Duke's enemies now feared his invitations more than his armies. Every meal that followed became a trial of nerves, a delicate dance between civility and death. To dine in the Middle Ages was to gamble with fate. Poison turned banquets into battlefields and servants into silent killers. A single plate could carry a crown or a curse. Paintings show kings laughing, music echoing, and platters piled high. But the true medieval feast was far darker. Behind the glittering chandeliers and smiling faces lay fear, hunger, and cruelty. Most banquets were more about spectacle than nourishment. Meat was oversalted, wine watered down, and hygiene non-existent. Rats scurried beneath tables, drawn by crumbs of excess. Servants were beaten for spilling wine, and jesters forced to perform until collapse. Meanwhile, outside castle walls, peasants starved in the cold. The feast became a cruel reminder of division, where a single roasted swan could feed 100, yet was devoured by one. Even the guests weren't safe. Feasts often ended in sickness as spoiled meats and infected water spread disease. In the absence of science, people blamed witchcraft or curses when entire tables fell ill. The hidden horror of these banquets wasn't just poison. It was the truth that these gatherings glorified power built on suffering. Beneath every royal toast was the silence of those who went hungry. History remembers the laughter, but not the screams that followed. Step inside a medieval banquet hall, and you'll find a world of beauty hiding deceit. The walls shimmered with gold, the air thick with perfumes and roasted meats, yet under the glitter, every smile was sharpened with greed. Royal banquets were political performances. Nobles used them to flaunt wealth, charm enemies, and hide conspiracies. The richer the display, the deeper the lie. Peacocks were served with feathers reattached, their eyes painted with jewels. Sugar sculptures portrayed kings as gods. Yet behind the spectacle, debts mounted, servants went unpaid, and the poor starved outside. King Philip of Anjou was infamous for such illusions. His feast dazzled foreign envoys, but each banquet was paid with borrowed gold. When his treasury finally collapsed, he fled his kingdom under cover of night. The tables that once held golden plates were found empty, covered in dust and decay. The banquet hall was never just about food. It was about control, about showing strength even as empires rotted from within. In the end, the lies crumbled faster than the bread. Among the deadliest tools in medieval politics was not the dagger, it was the cup. A single sip could crown a new ruler. The assassin's cup became legend among royal courts. A silent killer passed from hand to hand. One chilling tale comes from the Polish court of 3094. During a peace feast, a rival noble presented the king with a jewel-encrusted goblet as a gift of friendship. Unknown to all, the inner rim was coated with powdered poison that dissolved into wine. Hours later, the king was dead, his murderer long gone. The goblet, recovered years later, still bore faint traces of the toxin. Historians called it a masterpiece of assassination. No stab, no scream, only silence. Afterward, kings began to drink only from personal cups guarded by soldiers. Food testers grew rich, but lived short lives. The fear of the poisoned cup spread across Europe, turning even friendship into suspicion. In medieval times, to toast your ally was to tempt your fate. The sweetest wine often hid the deadliest venom. Servants were the unseen ghosts of the medieval feast, silent, invisible, and dangerously powerful. They carried trays of silver, poured the wine, and heard every whisper of betrayal. In their hands lay both life and death. While nobles laughed, servants plotted. Some were loyal, others were bought by gold or fear. In 1451, the poisoning of Lord Becket was traced not to a rival noble, but to his own cupbearer, bribed with a pouch of silver. The poison was slipped into his wine between songs, unseen, unstoppable. Yet not all servants were killers. Many were witnesses forced to clean the blood or hide the corpses of those who died at the table. They became keepers of secrets that could never be spoken. Their silence built empires, and their loyalty decided who lived to rule another day. The medieval banquet was a world divided, those who dined and those who served. But history forgets that sometimes the hand holding the platter held more power than the one wearing the crown. In the grand halls of medieval kings, the banquet table was more dangerous than the battlefield. Power was fragile, and poison was its sharpest blade. Every feast was a political arena where alliances were tested and enemies quietly erased. The infamous Banquet of Blood took place in Hungary in 1410. King Sigismund invited the lords who had conspired against him, promising forgiveness and peace. The nobles arrived dressed in velvet and gold, believing they were safe. But as the wine flowed, soldiers surrounded the hall. The doors were bolted shut. At the king's signal, guards drew their swords. Dozens of nobles were slaughtered where they sat, their blood soaking into the feast table. The king watched silently as his enemies fell, then calmly continued his meal. The massacre became a legend, a warning that royal mercy could never be trusted. From that day, banquets were feared across Europe. A king's invitation was no longer an honor. It was a gamble with death. In the Middle Ages, poison and power shared the same cup, and loyalty was just another dish served cold. Royal banquets dazzled the eye but drained entire kingdoms. The cost of a single feast could bankrupt a castle and starve hundreds. Kings and queens competed to outshine each other, turning food into a weapon of pride. At the courts of France, Queen Isabeau once demanded an entire ship built inside the Great Hall, filled with roasted fish and fruit sculpted into mermaids. The spectacle lasted one night, but cost enough to build 10 villages. Meanwhile, peasants outside her palace ate bark and boiled roots to survive the winter. Such extravagance came with consequences. Taxes soared, rebellions rose, and hatred festered among the poor. Chroniclers wrote that the people starved while their kings grew fat on gold. Even priests began to condemn gluttony as a sin equal to murder. Behind every shining platter lay debt, famine, and resentment. The feasts that once symbolized victory became reminders of corruption. In time, those same lavish halls would be stormed by the very peasants who had gone hungry, watching them. Royal luxury, it seemed, was not just wasteful, it was fatal. In the age of kings and castles, the art of war extended to the dinner table. Food, the very thing meant to sustain life, became a weapon sharper than any sword. Ambitious nobles learned that the quickest way to destroy a rival was not through open battle, but through hospitality. A poisoned pie, a spiced wine laced with venom, or even spoiled meat could bring down an entire house. These acts were difficult to trace the perfect crime in a world obsessed with honor and secrecy. One infamous case was that of Lady Mirabelle, a duchess known for her sweet gifts. She would send honeyed pastries to her enemies as gestures of peace. Many who tasted them died days later. Their deaths ruled illness. None dared accuse her. Her beauty and rank placed her beyond suspicion. In time, kings banned the sharing of food between rival families, fearing what might come hidden in a dish. Yet still, the custom continued in secret. The medieval banquet was a dangerous game, where the deadliest battles were fought not with swords, but with silver spoons. For every royal who ruled, there was someone trained to end their life, quietly, efficiently, and without trace. The royal poisoners were the most feared and protected assassins of the Middle Ages. Hidden behind the kitchens, they studied the craft of death. They learned which herbs caused pain, which mimicked illness, and which could kill without color or smell. Many were alchemists, experimenting on animals and prisoners to perfect their art. King Ferdinand of Spain was said to keep 3 poisoners in his service, not to kill his enemies, but to detect poisons meant for him. Ironically, he died during a feast, his own wine laced by one of them. The assassin vanished before the cup hit the floor. The role of poisoners became both myth and truth. Some were loyal defenders. Others Silent murderers. Every king lived in fear that his most trusted servant might also be his executioner. In the end, royal power did not rest on crowns or swords, but on the hope that one's next meal was safe. Sometimes, one meal could ignite a war. The Feast of Canterbury in 1297 was meant to unite two kingdoms, England and Scotland, through marriage. But what began in joy ended in blood. As the nobles dined beneath banners of peace, a heated argument erupted between two rival lords. Insults turned to threats, and in a flash, steel was drawn. One man fell dead across the table, his blood spilling into the wine. The hall descended into chaos, and the fragile truce shattered in an instant. What no one knew was that the fight had been planned. Hidden hands had stirred conflict with whispered lies, ensuring the alliance would fail. The murder at the feast became the spark that set both nations aflame. Within months, thousands were dead on the battlefield. Feasts were supposed to end wars, but in the medieval world, they often started them. The table meant for peace became a place of death, proving that in the Age of Kings, even celebration could be a weapon of war. In 1482, the grandest feast in Burgundian history was held to celebrate the birth of a prince. Nobles from across Europe attended, and the castle shone with gold and song.
But by dawn, the laughter had turned to screams.
According to legend, an old monk had cursed the feast, warning that gluttony shall bring ruin. The guests ignored him and indulged beyond reason. Hours later, dozens fell ill, choking, sweating, dying in agony. The food was said to be spoiled, but many whispered darker truths. That a vengeful alchemist had poisoned the royal wine in revenge for his brother's execution. Within a year, the Burgundian dynasty collapsed. The castle burned. The prince died, and the kingdom was absorbed by its rivals. Chroniclers later wrote that the Banquets' echo became the sound of a nation's death. Whether curse or crime, the result was the same. A night meant for joy became the spark that destroyed an empire. In medieval Europe, feasts were never just celebrations. They were omens of fate. And sometimes, death itself was the final guest. The pursuit of grandeur came at a deadly price. In 1405, during the Feast of St. John in Paris, King Charles VI hosted a masquerade ball where nobles dressed as wild men covered in pitch and feathers. When a torch slipped from a servant's hand, the hall erupted into flames. The air filled with screams as silken oil-fed fire devoured the dancers. 4 nobles burned alive before the king's horrified eyes. Historians later named it the Bal des Ardents, the burning ball. The tragedy exposed the madness of royal excess.
The people, starving and overtaxed, saw the flames as divine punishment for arrogance.
Whispers spread that God himself had cursed the crown.
The monarchy's image never recovered, and rebellion soon followed.
The incident became a symbol across Europe, a warning that even kings could not dine or dance safely when their greed consumed all else. In the medieval world, fire and feast often shared the same spark, both lit by pride, and both ending in ruin. When the Black Death swept across Europe, death sat at every table. Yet even as bodies piled in the streets, nobles continued their feasts, refusing to acknowledge the horror outside. In Venice, 1349, the Duke hosted a feast of life to defy death itself. Guests arrived in masks, shaped like skulls, dining beneath chandeliers made of bones. Laughter filled the hall, but the air was thick with infection.
Servants coughed as they poured wine.
Musicians collapsed mid-song. Within days, nearly every guest was dead. The Duke's defiance became his downfall. Chronicles say he died, clutching a golden goblet, whispering, "I drank to life," and found death. The Banquet of Bones became infamous across Europe, symbolizing the arrogance of rulers who believed wealth could buy safety. In truth, no amount of gold or glory could protect them from the unseen pestilence that stalked every breath. The medieval feast, once a symbol of power, became a silent funeral for the living. King Henry of Castile was known for his appetite, not for power, but for food. His banquets lasted from sunrise to midnight, with over 100 courses and endless wine. His cooks prepared dishes of swan, boar, and sugared fruits shaped like crowns. But his greed became his curse.
One winter, he hosted a 7-day feast to celebrate his victory over rebels.
He ate endlessly, refusing rest, declaring he would out-eat the devil himself. On the 6th night, he collapsed, his body unable to bear the strain. He died, choking on his final meal. Chroniclers called it the feast that devoured its king. His death marked the end of his dynasty, as his enemies rose while his people rejoiced. The same tables once laden with gold were soon stripped bare by soldiers. In medieval courts, gluttony was not just sin, it was suicide. The king who ruled through indulgence learned too late that even monarchs cannot feast forever. In 1437, Duke Alaric of Bavaria invited his rivals to a peace banquet. The hall was magnificent. Candles flickered on mirrors, music filled the air, and wine flowed like rivers. But beneath the floorboards, soldiers waited in silence. At midnight, the Duke gave a signal. The musicians stopped, the doors locked, and flames erupted from hidden torches. The guests realized too late that the feast had been their execution. The Duke watched as smoke filled the hall, his enemies' screams echoing through the stone walls.
When dawn came, the castle was quiet.
The Duke announced that peace had been achieved, but the horror spread, and within months, his reign collapsed under rebellion. His name was erased from the royal chronicles.
Known only as the Butcher of Bavaria, the Feast of Shadows became a whispered legend, the banquet where no guest returned.
In medieval history, hospitality was sacred, until it became the perfect disguise for murder.